Now we present Rostrum. Today you'll hear two lectures on technology. Carol Purcell of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee speaking on the American ideal of a democratic technology, from Jefferson to ecology, and Harvey Brooks of Harvard University speaking on science and technology, hope or catastrophe. The first speaker is Carol Purcell. He is visiting professor at the Center for 20th Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He served as Andrew W. Mellon Distinguished Professor of Humanities at Lehigh University from 1974 to 76, and also has been on the staff of the Smithsonian Institution. The following lecture is entitled The American Ideal of a Democratic Technology, from Jefferson to Ecology. It was taped at Iowa State University Monday, October 10th, 1977.
There has been, throughout American history, a continuing, if not indeed continuous, realization that, as Lewis Mumford phrased it, those who are concerned with maintaining democratic institutions must see to it that their constructive efforts include technology itself. In 1815, Thomas Jefferson, asked to comment on a steam engine developed by a fellow American, compared it to those he had seen in Europe, and articulated the American ideal of a democratic technology scaled to human needs. Writing to this inventor, he said, "I see indeed in yours the valuable properties of simplicity, cheapness, and accommodation to the small and numerous calls of life. And the calculations of its power appear sound and correct. The importance of your construction will be enhanced by the consideration that a smaller engine, applicable to our daily concerns, is infinitely more valuable than the greatest, which can be used only for great objects. For these interest the few alone, the former the many. I once had an idea that it might be possible to economize the steam of a common pot, kept boiling in the kitchen fire until its accumulation should be sufficient to give a stroke. And although the strokes might not be rapid, there would be enough of them in the day to raise from an adjacent well the water necessary for daily use, to wash the linen, knead the bread, beat the hominy, churn the butter, turn the spit, and do all other household offices which require only a regular mechanical motion. Of how much more value would this be to ordinary life than Watson Bolton's 30 pairs of millstones to be turned by one engine?" Well, the same desire for a technology scaled to everyday human needs, which are of interest to most of us, persists still in America and has found a recent voice in the movement for what is called appropriate technology. This dream and its antithetical nightmare have been described best, I think, by Lewis Mumford in the whole body of his work, but most succinctly in his 1964 essay entitled Authoritarian and Democratic Techniques. "My thesis," he wrote, "is that from late Neolithic times in the Near East, right down to our own day, two technologies have recurrently existed side by side. One authoritarian, the other democratic. The first system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable. The other man-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. The authoritarian centralized techniques drew on inventions and scientific discoveries of a high order: the written record, mathematics and astronomy, irrigation and canalization. Above all, it created complex human machines composed of specialized, standardized, replaceable, interdependent parts: the work army, the military army, the bureaucracy. From the beginning, these work armies and military armies raised the ceiling of human achievement in both construction and destruction. In our own time, these techniques have provided the masses with an astonishing array and abundance of material goods. But as Mumford warns, by progressively fulfilling this part of the democratic promise, our system has achieved a hold over the whole community that threatens to wipe out every other vestige of democracy. Opposed to this is a democratic techniques. In Mumford's words, the small-scale method of production, resting mainly on human skill and animal energy, but always, even when employing machines, remaining under the active direction of the craftsman or the farmer. Each group developing its own gifts through appropriate arts and social ceremonies, as well as making discreet use of the gifts of nature. Well, the conflict between these two techniques has waxed and waned throughout recorded history, but its modern intensification began at the same time as the United States. Brooke Hindle has called the simultaneity of the American and the Industrial Revolutions one of the staggering coincidences of American history. Mumford is more apprehensive than excited by the juxtaposition. At the very moment, he wrote, when Western nations threw off the ancient regimes of absolute government, operating under a once divine king, they were restoring this same system in a far more effective form in their technology, reintroducing coercions of a military character no less strict in the organization of a factory. Well, the resulting conflict has two facets, both of which have drawn attention throughout our history. In order to ensure the survival of democracy, one must preserve a democratic techniques. But to do this, first one must keep authoritarian techniques from concentrating in the hands of the few. And second, one must at the same time provide easy access to a democratic technology for the many. The prospect was hopeful during the years of the early republic. And as Hugo Meyer and others have pointed out, it soon became a major canon of our American faith that democracy and technology were symbiotic, that political, social, and economic liberty would cause technology to flourish, and that technology in turn would help to defend and extend such liberty. Asserting in 1792 that free governments are the only asylum and nursery for science and the arts, a conceit which fooled us just 20 years ago this month into expecting the Russians not to be able to orbit a satellite, which they put up at the same time we brought out the Edsel, by the way. You can remember those two things that way. Saying the free governments are the only asylum and nursery for science and the arts, Joseph Barnes in 1792 explained, free governments have always been found most disposed to encourage the rise and progress of science and the arts. And for this obvious reason, that in republican governments, merit alone is or ought to be the standard of character, which necessarily excites that laudable spirit of emulation so essential to society, and which never fails to produce celebrated philosophers, statesmen, husbandmen, and artists. The necessary effect of which is not only the promotion of science and useful arts, but the happiness of men, the primary, the grand object of their existence. And summarizing his argument, he said, philosophy being the source of liberty, liberty of all improvements in science and the arts, the improvement in science and the arts of all the real accomplishments of the human species. Consequently, philosophy is essentially the source of all virtue. Paradoxically, Barnes developed this argument to argue against the strict patent law of 1790, under which Secretary of State Jefferson was granting monopolies with a parsimony upsetting to inventors. Few apparently were willing to take the course of Benjamin Franklin with regard to his Pennsylvania fireplace. Instead of accepting a patent proffered by the governor of Pennsylvania, he advertised it instead as in a pamphlet, complete with drawings, description, and instructions to masons for setting up the fireplace, and published at his own expense. He declined the patent, he said, from a principle which has ever weighed with me on such occasions, viz., that as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any inventions of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. Well, so long as technology relied upon the energy of sun and wind and water, the triumph of authoritarian techniques appeared unlikely, or at least easily avoidable. The nation was recently set up as a republic, not a monarchy. A standing army had been explicitly rejected. The potential energy of woods and farmland, of falling water and blowing wind were widely and all but freely available, and the technology to harness them was cheap and widely known. And the sources of such energy could not be easily monopolized. As Jefferson had hoped, there was still an emphasis in the early republic upon a democratic techniques. Even the coming of the American system of manufactures seemed to strengthen the democratic nature of American technology. In 1849, the touring Scottish chemist James F.W. Johnston visited an agricultural fair in Syracuse, New York. And he noted that the general character of the implements was economy in construction and in price. And the exhibition was large and interesting. Plows, hay rakes, forks, scythes, and cooking stoves, he said, were very abundant, and many of them well and beautifully made. The potato grips and forks of various kinds, cut from sheet steel, were very elastic, light, strong, and cheap. And only a few years later, the British machine makers Whitworth and Wallace wrote that labor-saving machines are most successfully employed in the manufacture of agricultural implements. In a plow manufactory at Baltimore, they said 8 machines are employed in the various parts of the woodwork. With these machines, 7 men are able to make the wooden parts of 30 plows per day. One result of this extension of the American system from small arms, where it was born, to the manufacture of plows, was that the implements made at this factory sold for as little as $2.50. Surely the democratic nature of agricultural technology during the 19th century, and therefore its relatively low price, was as important as free land in extending a nation of yeoman farmers across the continent. The American system, of course, with its machine designers and tenders, did not encompass the entirety of American technology. Many areas, farming and the building trade spring to mind, long resisted the intrusion of machine logic. This is one reason why Americans were able, even when they were not forced to move from job to job with easy proficiency. Whitworth and Wallace noted that the citizen of the United States knows that matters are different from him than with the workers of Britain, and seems really to pride himself in not remaining overlong at any particular occupation, and being able to turn his hand to some dozen different pursuits in the course of his life. Karl Marx at one point quoted a Frenchman who had moved to San Francisco. "I was firmly convinced," said the Frenchman, that I was fit for nothing but letterpress printing. But once in the midst of this world of adventurers who change their occupation as often as they do their shirts, egad, I did as the others. As mining did not turn out remunerative enough, I left for the town, where in succession I became a typographer, slater, plumber, etc. In consequence of thus finding out that I am fit for any sort of work, I felt less of a mollusk and more of a man. Well, it's been said that America was the only country that began perfect and hoped to improve. And not content to leave well enough alone, Americans wanted progress, and progress, as it turned out, was away from this democratic technique. Early in the century, Oliver Evans, after Benjamin Franklin, our first great inventor, had confidently asserted that we see by daily experience, and what a startling thing this was to be able to say in the early 19th century. Couldn't have said it a century before. We see by daily experience that every art may be improved. Late in the century, when Mark Twain's Hank Morgan gained power in King Arthur's court, he recorded that the very first official thing I did in my administration, and it was on the very first day of it, was to start a patent office. For I knew that a country without a patent office and good patent laws was just a crab and couldn't travel any way but sideways or backwards. The first thing you want in a new country, he said, is a patent office, then work up your school system, and after that, out with your newspaper. Well, little wonder that an anonymous scribbler was inspired by an industrial exhibition in 1828 to write these lines: "Genius of art, what achievements are thine, to delight and astonish the mind, the efforts of knowledge and fancy combine. But triumph to thee is assigned. How high swell the bosoms of patriots with pride, to behold the rich treasures which here are supplied, while invention's bright wand in the artisan's hand points to glory, the freemen of freedom's own land." But authoritarian techniques was not so easily ignored. The power fantasies of inventors and social engineers such as J.A. Etzler had a democratic appeal, but an authoritarian promise. In 1841, Etzler published a sequel to his book Paradise, which Thoreau had reviewed quite harshly, in which he attempted to prove, as he said, from experience, how to cultivate 20,000 acres by one machine and 3 or 4 men, with a capital of less than $1 per acre, in the most superior mode, how to clear land from trees, stumps, roots, and stones, fill and drain swamps, make dams, canals, ditches, roads, and perform any kind of work in the ground, build houses, and furnish as much inanimate power as desired, forever, for any place and any stationary machine, all by the same system. And in an appeal that was to be echoed many times over the next century in America, Etzler besought, "Ye who are poor and of the laboring class, do not be alarmed at this invention. It will not deprive you of your poor pittance for sustaining life, obtainable now by your petty drudgery. With 20,000 acres when 20,000 acres of garden can be cultivated by 3 or 4 men, with but $1 capital once every year per acre, you may easily become shareholders of joint stock companies by paying from $20 to $30, and even this small sum, partly or entirely, in work of from 1 to 3 months, once forever, and then enjoy the produce of from 10 to 20 acres for each share, without further trouble or expense, and then live like gentlemen and ladies to much better purposes than those of a dull animal in a treadmill." A great promise. And it's surely significant, I think, that this kind of talk of mechanical slavery increased precisely at that point in American history when the slavery of human beings was increasingly condemned. I think we passed very quickly and without thinking much from using people for slaves to using machines for slaves. And the analogy was quite explicit. And the same hope of a life of ease, someone else or something else doing our work for us, lay behind both. In fact, the extension of modern technology to agriculture came not only through the introduction of labor-saving machines, but through a rebirth of the work armies of the ancient Near East. In their recent book on slavery, Time on the Cross, Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman point out that the regimen of the large southern plantation was more like an assembly line, as they say, than the routine of many factories in the antebellum era. And indeed, they go so far as to assert that the great plantations were the first large, scientifically managed business enterprises, and that black slaves were the first group of workers to be trained in the work rhythm which later became characteristic of industrial society. The giant railroad companies of the period were also sources of a growing authoritarian techniques, rationalizing as they did for their own needs and convenience everything from business forms through political corruption to the establishment of local time. Significantly, I think railroads were also among the earliest employers of industrial scientists. Just as significant for many Americans was the fact that such techniques were welcomed despite their sometimes obvious anti-democratic tendencies. Speaking in the aggregates, which were necessary for authoritarian techniques, the astronomer and political economist Simon Newcomb insisted first that the question whether the effect of any policy is good or bad depends very largely upon whether it increases or diminishes the sum total of the products necessary for human welfare. And then he claims specifically that carrying passengers 40 miles an hour for 2 or 3 cents a mile is a fact which outweighs all we can say about watered stock. He was quite proud of the fact that average working people in the late 19th century could travel faster and cheaper than kings could have a century earlier. And that made it all worthwhile. In one field of American endeavor after another, what Mumford called the machine and the mechanical collective triumphed over democratic techniques. The arts of war and self-government were revolutionized. Agriculture, the backbone of democratic techniques, was industrialized, mechanized, made energy intensive, and ever more efficient. Farmers who could not compete with the new technological system of machines, irrigation, fertilizer, and so forth, fled to the cities and became dependent upon those who stayed behind. These, in their turn, however prosperous, were locked into an ever-tightening circle of technological constraints. With transportation, as with food and most other of life's needs, Americans were asked or forced to accept efficient, increased production with its machine logic and rhythms. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, told a congressional committee in 1912, in a period when America seemed to many in the middle class to be coming unstuck with social violence. He said that under the benign rule of scientific management, and I quote him, both sides take their, he means capital and labor, take their eyes off the division of the surplus as the all-important matter, and together turn their attention toward increasing the size of the surplus until this surplus becomes so large that it is unnecessary to quarrel over how it shall be divided. Economic growth, in other words, was to be a substitute for social justice. Well, it was, in short, what Mumford has called the magnificent bribe. By accepting the new techniques and under the democratic authoritarian social compact, each member of the community may claim every material advantage. I'm quoting Mumford. But on one condition, that he must not merely ask for nothing that the system does not provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized in the precise quantities that the system rather than the person requires. Not everyone, of course, acquiesced willingly in this compact. In 1896, a Minnesota state senator wrote disgustedly to Ignatius Donnelly, "While we think, brag of it, how far we are ahead of any former civilization, I, for one, am disgusted of the bragging and the boasting, and simply believe it is not true. I have heard it asserted that the printing press, telegraph, etc. have educated the masses, that the direful relapse will not come again, as in the past. Bosh. Our would-be masters have a corner on the whole outfit of the inventions, and they are now just as much employed to the destruction of human rights as formerly. In the absence of those inventions, the people's ignorance was used as a means." Well, this corporate and political monopolization of the very technology which was supposed to preserve the people's liberty, and I commend to you a recent book by David Noble, America by Design, was one of the problems which motivated those who had still some vision of a democratic techniques. One promising area of reform, and we still see echoes of this, was thought to be electricity. And I present that to you as an example. And by 1915, engineers were confident that they could transmit economical amounts of electricity up to 100 miles from central stations, far enough to provide nearly all Americans with adequate, flexible, cheap, clean, and divisible energy. The fact that as late as 1935, only 10% of American farms were so served, and the fact that rates in the United States, as compared with Canada, for example, were so much higher, led some critics to see in a reform of the electrical utility industry a new opportunity to fulfill that dream of a democratic techniques. In the 1920s, Morris Llewellyn Cook, the progressive engineer, produced for Governor Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania a comprehensive giant power plan, which without making power generating capacity public, would have accomplished the twin goals of cheap and abundant available energy. After a limited start in the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1933, the Rural Electrification Administration, set up in 1935 with Cook as the first administrator, finally succeeded in pushing rural lines to nearly all American farms. During the Great Depression, a host of measures were introduced to the Congress to break what was seen as a monopoly on the technical expertise of America. Despite the seemingly auspicious atmosphere for reform in the 1930s, none of these democratizing measures were adopted. And the nation began its war mobilization in 1940 with a system very much like it had entered the 30s. In the 1940s, led by Vannevar Bush, the nation's spokesman for science and technology deliberately chose two cardinal principles in gearing up science and technology for war. First, to beat the Axis powers as quickly as possible, and second, to carry out mobilization and to beat the Axis with as little disruption of the status quo as possible. They said this was no time to try social tinkering. What this all meant was that, in short, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Wartime spending for science and technology, which in many ways gave shape to and had a potential for reshaping American society, this spending was instead funneled into centers of excellence, which turned out, to no one's surprise, and quite naturally, to be General Motors, AT&T, General Electric in the corporate side, and such educational institutions as Harvard, MIT, and the University of California. I'd be curious to know what Iowa State got during World War II in the way of science and technology R&D funds. I would venture very little. Well, such an elitist mobilization was not inevitable. Critics like I.F. Stone and Bruce Catton pointed out that a democratic war effort mobilized through a democratic technology was the best guarantee of a democratic post-war society. But in fact, this criticism was ignored. On the very eve of war, Waldemar Kaempfert, science editor for the New York Times, worried, mass consumption, mass recreation, mass distribution of energy, and the collectivist utilization of identical things are impossible without control of mass production, without organization. The inventors have standardized behavior, pleasures, tastes. There is less freedom than there was a century ago because of invention. There will be still less tomorrow. Well, the decade of the 50s and 60s saw the rediscovery of a host of problems that Americans had thought long since solved, and this in the midst of this reified system of authoritarian techniques. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963 demonstrated that women's rights had not been entirely secured by the right to vote. Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, in 1965, attacked the most American of all machines and recalled the continuing abuses of corporate irresponsibility. Michael Harrington, in 1962, reminded the nation of the existence of the other America, that 1/3 of a nation which still lived in poverty. And Rachel Carson, in 1962, in her book, Silent Spring, proved that the progressive conservation movement had not solved all of the nation's environmental problems. The rediscovery and the revitalization of the ideal of a democratic techniques rested on no such single book, although several struck the same theme, but rather grew out of the resurgence of environmental concern, the development of the so-called counterculture, and the successive revelations of technological arrogance in such diverse but critical places as Detroit, Vietnam, and the boardrooms of the petroleum industry. In 1967, the late Paul Goodman mourned what he called the betrayal of the promise of independent scientific technology, envisioned by the idealists of the 19th century. They thought, he said, of science as humble, brave, and austere, and of technology as circumspect, neat, and serviceable. Working by its own morale, scientific technology should by now have simplified life rather than complicated it, emptied the environment rather than cluttered it, and educated an inventive and skillful generation rather than a conformist and inept one. In a later essay, Goodman called upon technicians to fulfill their proper roles, as he said, as moral philosophers, acting with foresight, caution, and prudence. Well, many of those who today advocate a technology characterized by foresight, caution, and prudence are to be found working under the banner of appropriate or alternative or intermediate technology. Popularly identified with the late British economist E.F. Schumacher and his slogan, "Small is beautiful," the movement is often focused on third world nations. VITA, for example, the Volunteers in Technical Assistance, founded in 1959, advises developing countries on the use of skills and materials that are locally available, or if equipment has to be imported, on designs that can be repaired by the village craftspeople. Better-known groups have concentrated on our own problems of overdevelopment. Private efforts such as the New Alchemy Institute on Cape Cod and the Farallons Institute in California have gained some notoriety for their work. The founder of the latter group, in fact, Sim van der Ren, has recently been appointed state architect of California by Governor Jerry Brown, himself an avowed disciple of Schumacher. Van der Ren has established in his agency a new Office of Appropriate Technology, which is attempting, I think with some success, to influence other state agencies to adopt such technologies as solar power. At the federal level, a newly funded National Center for Appropriate Technology is being established in Butte, Montana. In describing its efforts, Science magazine gave as good a definition of the subject as we are likely to get. Appropriate technology, said Science, generally means technology that is small, easy to understand and maintain, cheap, dependent on local resources, and fitted to local needs. It makes heavy use of renewable resources and makes minimal demands on capital and on non-renewable environmental and energy resources. Well, Thomas Jefferson could hardly have put it better. But this redefinition for our own time of the traditional ideal of a democratic technology answers only half the problem. There is a real danger that, as in the past, the technology that begins as democratic will be quickly absorbed into a larger authoritarian context. The history of energy use in America provides a case in point, and my last one. During most of its first century, the United States depended upon widely available, easily harnessed energy sources: animals, wind, water, and wood, which is now called more gloriously biomass. There were, in terms of our definition, these were small, easy to understand and maintain, cheap, dependent on local resources, and fitted to local needs. Since 1850, however, our consumption of energy has multiplied more than 30 times, and whereas wood supplied 90% of our needs in 1850, by 1900, coal had become the dominant fuel, providing 70% of our energy, and by 1950, oil and natural gas were the leading contributors, providing 55.5%. Not only had we become an energy-intensive society, the source of that energy was increasingly non-renewable, and as importantly, was increasingly vulnerable to monopolization. Potentially, the emphasis on appropriate technology on solar and wind power to provide for our energy needs is a progressive step toward reestablishing the democratic nature of our energy mix. The potential, however, remains only that. And there is increasing evidence that it, too, might well become authoritarian. Ralph Nader quipped some months ago, if 20 years ago title to the sun had been given to Exxon with a depletion allowance, we'd have solar energy today. And everybody laughed, but in effect, the government is today doing something very like that. As Science magazine has reported, government planners seem to have trouble grasping the point that solar power is fundamentally different from our dominant energy sources. Solar energy is democratic, and that's a quote from Science. It falls on everyone and can be put to use by individuals and small groups of people. Instead, the government's research program has emphasized large central stations to produce solar electricity in some distant future, and has largely ignored small solar devices for producing on-site power. It is obvious that on-site solar power would provide a democratic alternative to the energy monopolies, while plans for orbiting reflectors and power towers would enhance their position. As Science comments, the centerpiece of the government's solar energy program is proceeding from small to large tests in a fashion that is remarkably parallel to the well-established pattern of nuclear reactor development. Big facilities, big expenditures, and a multi-decade development program all characterize the program for centralized solar thermal generating stations. And much the same story appears to be true of the federal government's minuscule wind energy program. The fact is that this authoritarian pattern grows not out of the nature of the technology itself. Solar and wind resources are by their nature democratic, but rather from the larger social techniques which prevail in this country. Well, looking back over the course of American history, The role played by technology in bringing us to our present state is both obvious and at the same time too little studied. Scholars such as Hugo Meyer have illuminated the predominant belief that American technology and democracy were not only compatible, but mutually fulfilling. John Cowenhoven has maintained that this democratic technology, in fact, defines the unique nature of American culture. Leo Marx has brilliantly described and analyzed those voices of dissent, which attempted to somehow come to grips with both the pastoral and the industrial. As we build upon these studies, however, it is important to keep several major points in mind, and I want to leave you with these. First, to an important degree, the American experience in this regard has been advanced but not entirely unique. Mumford has found the roots of authoritarian technique in the ancient Middle East, and in his monumental study of the myth of the machine has traced the evolution of what he calls the Pentagon of power. Similarly, Lynn White has insisted, persuasively I think, that the roots of our ecological crisis are not uniquely American, but extend back to fantasies of power originating in the medieval period. Second, it is important to remember that the voices of Jefferson and Thoreau, of Mumford and Goodman, do not belong simply to an archaic and inert past, but are part of a continuing tradition of perception that technology does not simply affect social institutions, it is a social institution, and as such is of proper concern to those who would preserve our democratic liberties. By the way, I think it's significant and tragic that while we have spent 100 years trying to find the right mix of humanities to lay upon engineering students, I have never heard the proposition put forward seriously in any university that liberal arts students, to be truly liberally educated, should know something of technology. It is a part of the human condition and human activity that we badly need to know about. And most of us, and I include myself among that group, know far too little. Third, it should also be obvious that technology is not indivisible. It is not autonomous and does not contain some inner logic which makes inevitable the kind of world in which we find ourselves. Indeed, the traditions of technology, simplicity, cheapness, and accommodation are the very virtues which Jefferson saw as characterizing a democratic techniques. What we have today, a mega machine displaying exactly the opposite characteristics, is not due to the logic of technology or the wrong-headedness of engineers, but to some other force at work in American society. Finally, it is important to remember that this whole question is one of more than simple academic interest. The very survival of our democratic society is dependent upon an understanding of those forces working to destroy it. Authoritarian techniques tend to an integration and uniformity which inevitably create a social and natural environment which is not only unpalatable, but unstable as well. Openness and diversity, characteristics of a democratic techniques, are essential for the kind of successful adaptations which our society must make to survive. Thank you.
That was Carol Purcell, visiting professor at the Center for 20th Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, speaking on the American ideal of a democratic technology, from Jefferson to ecology. The lecture was taped on Monday, October 10th. Rostrum will continue after we pause 10 seconds for station identification. This is Iowa Public Radio. The other speaker on today's program is Harvey Brooks, the Benjamin Pierce Professor of Technology and Public Policy at Harvard University. He is a past president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served the U.S. government in many advisory capacities, including membership on the President's Science Advisory Committee and the National Science Board. The following lecture is entitled Science and Technology, Hope or Catastrophe. It was taped at Iowa State University, Monday, April 4th, 1977.
Gerald Holton has divided attitudes towards the human future into two categories. There are the pessimists who believe that the salvation of the world is impossible because of the depredations of science and technology, and the optimists who believe that the salvation of the world is inevitable because science and technology will ride in to rescue us in the nick of time. Until recently, most scientists were squarely and almost automatically in the optimist camp. The pessimists were to be found almost exclusively among humanists. C.P. Snow invented the phrase "the two cultures" to identify what he saw as the profound cultural and temperamental gap separating scientists from the rest of high culture. Only the scientists had the future in their bones, he asserted, and by implication, scientists embodied most hopes for a better human future. In the last decade, the pessimists have acquired some recruits among leading scientists, and to a much lesser degree among engineers. Even among the great majority of scientists who remain in the optimist camp, the position has receded to the point of view that the salvation of the world is possible but not inevitable. The inevitability of progress is now treated as a Victorian anachronism, even by scientists. There are differences among disciplines, of course. Pessimism is most prevalent in the field of ecology, which became intellectually respectable on the strength of it. The diffusion of pessimism among intellectuals accompanied the popularization of the science of ecology. More recently, pessimism has spread more widely among the biological disciplines, especially in the most successful one, molecular biology, and has been accompanied by questioning of the desirability of further advances. It has also become fashionable in the behavioral sciences, especially those most concerned with the hidden springs of individual and social behavior. The optimist camp is clearly headed by the economists, who, among all intellectuals, retain the greatest pristine faith in the powers of science and technology, much more than the natural scientists themselves. Having neglected technology ever since Marx, the economists 2 decades ago re-identified technology as the engine of growth and social progress. Physicists sit more on the fence, with younger physicists being more pessimistic than their older peers. Probably this is partly the outcome of the close involvement of physics and many of the leaders of physics in military technology and nuclear weapons. And it is a kind of intellectual penance for the post-war euphoria about the potential benefits of physics to mankind. It is probably no accident that the most emphatic scientific expressions of the pessimist viewpoint come from representatives of the two disciplines which are the most holistic in their approach, ecology and systems analysis. However, most ecologists are pessimists, while both the most uncritical proponents of scientific optimism and the greatest pessimists are to be found among the systems analysts. Both these disciplines are concerned with complex systems in which everything is connected to everything else, and they focus on the connections rather than the parts. The ecologists take the position that things are so complicated that one can never be confident of the effects of any human intervention in an ecosystem. The better one understands the system, the more likely is one to find that an intervention is ultimately bad, no matter how beneficial it may seem at first. Hence, technology, as one of the most important forms of intervention, should be deemed deleterious until proved otherwise by searching research and analysis. The view of the pessimist school of systems analysts is typified by the systems dynamics school of J. Forrester and his disciples at MIT. In contrast with the ecologists, their pessimism seems to arise more from confidence in their methodology than from caution in the face of complexity and uncertainty. The pessimistic behavioral scientists are those used to dealing with complex social systems and with the limited rationality of social and political behavior. Thus, they are skeptical of the ability of social and political institutions to cope with the increasing burden of choices brought about by the applications of science and technology. In their view, technological change, no matter how beneficially intended, overloads social systems and thereby produces more unintended than intended consequences. Moreover, the politics of management of complex technologies tends to undermine the presumed technical rationality of such systems, producing an ever-widening gap between technical plans and their implementation in the real world. For example, the most sophisticated school of critics of nuclear power now concedes that it can be made safe technically, but argues that you cannot count on real human institutions and people to execute the designs and to follow the specified operational procedures. One of the most dramatic statements of the ecological perspective came from a manifesto of 30 British scientists issued in 1972 under the title Blueprint for Survival. This group called for an immediate cessation of economic growth. 50 more scientists endorsed their report in a letter to the London Times, claiming that, and I quote, "If current trends are allowed to persist, the breakdown of society and the irreversible disruption of the life support system on this planet, possibly by the end of the century, certainly within the lifetime of our children, are inevitable," end of quote. These dire predictions were supported with seeming scientific precision by the computer models World 2 and World 3 developed by Forrester and Meadows under the sponsorship of the International Club of Rome, which ensured a wide public audience. One typical humanist perspective is perhaps the draft of a statement from the World Council of Churches on Global Problems, which opened with the following words, and I quote, "However robust the faith of yesterday in the power of science and technology is today misplaced and therefore misleading. In fact, the reductionist, triumphalist, manipulative approach of science and technology has itself been in large part responsible for our predicament," end of quote. So much for the pristine faith of the economists. Other important currents must be mentioned on the pessimistic side of this debate. In the cases I've just cited, oncoming catastrophe is attributed to the application of scientific technology. Many regard this catastrophe as the inevitable consequence of the underlying premises and attitudes of the scientific revolution of 300 years ago. There are others, however, who attribute our problems not to science itself, but to its embodiment in a particular kind of technology, high technology, which is equated to large-scale centralized technology operated and controlled by large impersonal bureaucracies, both corporate and governmental. These bureaucracies are said to be dominated by experts who are not politically accountable to the people their decisions affect. To a remarkable degree, nuclear power has become the devil symbol for this group, the epitome of everything they deplore about modern scientific technology. This school of critics of science and technology nevertheless asserts the possibility of an alternative but equally sophisticated and scientific low technology or soft technology which emphasizes decentralization, local self-sufficiency, and small-scale enterprise controlled by consumers and craftsmen. They look forward to a society of the future in which, once again, as in the mid-19th century America, most of the population is self-employed rather than working in large organizations. Solar energy, windmills, and renewable resources have become the positive symbols for this group. In a sense, they seem to have transferred an aspect of the ecological model of nature to human societies. The society they envision is harmonious and self-regulating, like an idealized ecosystem, and incorporates some of the ideology of a classical free enterprise, although their attitude towards individual choice and freedom seems ambiguous. The Bible of this group is a book, Small is Beautiful, written by a German-born British economist, E.F. Schumacher. This viewpoint seems to overlook that in real life, ecosystems which are macroscopically harmonious are very tough on individuals. This latter school of thought is hard to classify unequivocally as either optimists or pessimists. While they take ecological doom seriously, they believe it can be averted through appropriate science and technology, but only in a context of a radical change of social values and social structure, which harks back to the America of Jefferson, a world of small farmers and entrepreneurs living in small, largely self-sufficient communities and working with tools provided by democratically managed science and technology. It is indeed an appealing picture, consonant with the American preference for rural over urban values. While many sympathize with it as an alternative lifestyle which should be available to small groups in an affluent society, and certainly as something perhaps appropriate for underdeveloped countries, few believe it to be a realistic goal for the great majority of citizens in the developed countries. Through much of the post-World War II era, scientists have justified government support of basic research on the grounds that it was the indispensable substratum of technological innovation, which was itself taken to be an almost automatic and intrinsically good consequence of science. Now science, to an extent, finds itself hoist on its own petard, held responsible for the evils of technology regarded as grown out of control, a blind monster advancing according to its own inexorable internal logic without democratic accountability. The appropriate technology movement, popularized by Schumacher, may perhaps be interpreted as an effort of basic science to dissociate itself from recent trends in technology and to present an alternative image of society equally based on science. This group is opposed both to modern socialism and to modern capitalism and seems to look to its model more to the sayings of Chairman Mao, though in an image of Mao's China which bears little resemblance to the reality portrayed by Western economists who have actually studied the Chinese economy. There are, of course, understandable reasons behind the modern revolt of intellectuals against science and technology. This revolt, incidentally, is not new. It arises almost once in a generation and has from the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution. Largely confined to the educated class, it is much more important today than in the past because the well-educated represent a much larger and more rapidly growing fraction of the population than ever before. All of post-war science and technology stands in the shadow of the most intense application of theoretical knowledge to the arts of war in the history of man, a time in which worldwide one scientist or engineer in 4 is employed in military research or development. And above all this sits the ominous image of the mushroom cloud. None of this can be simply wished away as the abuse of science by society, since respected leaders of science have played a far from passive role in selling these dangerous toys to receptive politicians and bureaucrats. It was none other than the most humane and kindly of men, Albert Einstein, who helped sell President Roosevelt on the Manhattan Project in World War II. And as Herbert York has demonstrated in several books and articles, little of the weapons revolution of the past 3 decades would have occurred without the active initiative and even political salesmanship of prestigious and respected scientists, acting out of what they sincerely believed at the time to be the most worthy and constructive of motives. Of course, like others, they were captives of the general political climate of their times, and their views, as in other cases, may have contained a component of rationalization of personal ambition. Science has also been blamed for environmental degradation, largely because it is the base of so much of technology. Yet, ironically enough, much of what has become such a source of alarm today would never have been suspected without the instruments and techniques provided by science. The famous Los Angeles smog was attributed to backyard incinerators, and until in the early 1950s, a Caltech chemist, Hagenschmidt, proposed a complicated theory for the catalytic formation of smog by the action of sunlight on the invisible and unsmellable constituents of automobile exhausts, and was able to prove his hypothesis in the laboratory. Unlike the belching smokestacks of the 19th century, today's pollution consists mostly of substances undetectable by the human senses. What is detectable is usually the product of complex secondary chemical or biological processes acting on the primary effluents to produce new substances, processes that we would not have even whose existence we would not have even suspected without the increase in scientific understanding. Thus, invisible auto exhausts produce smog. Invisible sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants interact with subvisible smoke particles to produce hazardous sulfate aerosols. Innocuous phosphates dissolved in water serve as nutrients for the growth of algae, which die and are decomposed by bacteria to form stinking watercourses and eutrophied lakes. Invisible carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels is the source of future climatic changes, which can only be understood or predicted by sophisticated computer models of the atmosphere. Little of the pollution which causes us such concern today would have produced health or environmental effects which would have been detectable by our ancestors, beset as they were by infectious diseases borne by drinking water, contaminated drinking water, and in other ways. Perhaps the most striking example of the subtlety of the modern type of pollution is the current theory of the effects of fluorocarbons on stratospheric ozone, or even the more subtle and speculative theory of the effects of nitrogen fertilizers and combustion products on the ozone layer, which shields us from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. These global effects could never incidentally be detected by unaided human experience. Without the stimulus of an ingenious scientific hypothesis, nobody would have even thought to look for the effect with instruments or by epidemiological studies. The effects in question are masked by too many background fluctuations, which are larger, though more localized in space and time. One of the difficulties is that we are talking of human impacts which lie many decades in the future from the time that the causative activities are occurring. Many other pollutants which concern us today have similar built-in time delays in their human effects, so that we have to be able to predict them scientifically many years in advance in order to install them. For example, carcinogens, that is to say cancer-producing substances in air, water, or food, if ingested today, may not produce cancer for 30 or 40 years. The same is true of low levels of radiation. If we wait to detect effects through the careful observation of health statistics, the potential future effect may have accumulated to dangerous proportions and will be reversible only after many years. Should we then blame science for making possible a technology which causes these insidious effects, albeit usually with accompanying immediate and desired social and economic benefits, such as personal mobility and the abolition of hard physical labor? Or should we praise science for being able to warn us of these effects before there is serious potential damage? In this sense, we can say that science is both the mother of technology and its conscience, and the conscience role of science has increased by leaps and bounds in recent years. Science and technology, like almost every other human activity, are mixed blessings, and our ability to separate the good from the bad is inevitably only partial. This is aggravated by the fact that both the good and the bad potential seem to vary more widely from the average as science and technology progress. It is true, of course, today that the world faces a unique situation without precedent in human history. In large part, because of our scientifically generated capacity to grow food and prevent disease, The human population is growing at more than twice the rate ever experienced in the past, absorbing resources that could otherwise be used to generate economic development and a better quality of life for the existing population, and possibly thereby triggering a reduction in human fertility. Present population growth rates must begin to level off within the next 25 years or so. This will happen either through reduced birth rates or through a restoration of the death rate by starvation and disease to what has been the normal expectation throughout most of man's existence on this planet, with the exception of a few places in the past and most of the world in the last 25 years. We live in a world in which interdependence becomes ever more important relative to the independence and self-determination of any human subgroup, such as a nation or tribe. Our capacity to use science to create wealth, though it has raised material standards everywhere, has differentially benefited those whose ancestors first hit upon the scientific method of knowing, the most potent cultural change that man has ever experienced. This, plus related differential rates of population growth, has resulted in an ever-widening income gap between the rich and the poor countries. By itself, this would not be so dangerous, except that the poor can no longer be kept in ignorance of the good life, or at least what appears to them as the good life as conveyed to them by modern communications and travel. Thus, the application of science has both made possible a gap and also the information flow that tends to make the gap intolerable to those who have not crossed it. The dilemma that we face can best be described by saying that we are confronted with unprecedented problems, but also with unprecedented tools with which to solve them. Both the problems and the tools derive from the application and diffusion of science and technology, and we have no way of knowing today whether the problems or the tools will prove more potent. Indeed, even the recognition and subsequent definition of the problems are dependent on the knowledge and insights derived from science and upon our ability to integrate information and data about human activity and the environment on a worldwide basis. Unfortunately, as the power of our tools increases, it becomes more apparent that it is an ambivalent power with ever greater potential for both good and evil. We seem to be traversing an ever narrower ridge towards the peak of a better life, but with a precipice of disaster ever closer on either side of us. The question is whether we will continue toward the mountaintop or whether we will stumble off the precipice as a result of some apparently minor misstep. The range of human choice widens at the same time that the possible price of error escalates. There is one school of pessimism that presents the world's dilemma as primarily material and technical. In this view, we are running out of finite natural resources and irretrievably befouling the life support systems we will need to sustain us in the future. This is the blueprint for survival school that I referred to earlier. In order to avoid disaster, we must drastically curtail our material aspirations and develop immediately a way of sharing the world's natural resources in an equitable manner at a drastically curtailed level of material consumption. The real pessimists, like Robert Heilbrunner, in fact, go on to say that since we can never summon the political will to share resources, the civilized world is doomed to perish in a thermonuclear conflagration brought on by the competition for finite resources. In this view of the world, we are in a zero-sum game, and the problem is how to share essentially fixed wealth and income on a basis acceptable to all capable of registering their aspirations in the international political system. There are also variants of this gloomy outlook. For example, there is the lifeboat ethic attributed to Garrett Hardin, who suggests that to preserve the ecosystem, some of humanity must be allowed to starve in order that the rest may survive. During the world food crisis of 1973, a few experts were talking of triage, allowing the hopeless cases, in this instance the desperately poor fourth world with the most rapid population growth and few indigenous resources, to die, and concentrating our food and other aid on those for whom there was some hope of improvement. Another interesting group that has emerged is the advocates of negative population growth, actually the successor of the zero population growth movement of a few years ago. They would like to see the world population reduced to the point where the world's resources and ecosystems can sustain an adequate standard of living for all. All these variants of pessimism share the perspective of a rigidly finite world, and discussion centers on how to divide this unexpandable pie. There is, however, another point of view that comes somewhat closer to my own. It is that the resource base is constantly shifting and expanding with increasing knowledge and the evolution of technology, and that our problem is not how to divide a fixed pie, but how to withhold enough money from current consumption and direct it in the most efficient way towards expanding our resource base by learning how to extract less accessible or more dilute resources, by substituting abundant for scarce raw materials, and by deriving the same level of material amenity from less resources through more efficient modes of consumption. As one example, Dr. Robert Ayers has made a rather careful analysis of energy use in the United States economy during 1971. From it, he concludes that from a strictly technological viewpoint, that is to say, ignoring political and institutional barriers, we could provide exactly the present mix of final consumption services, that is, personal mobility, dwelling comfort, recreation, and household amenities, with a use of well under 2% of the input energy we actually used in 1971. Ayers considers his estimate conservative in that it takes very little credit for technological innovation, only straightforward application of known technological principles. This is put forward not as a policy, but only to illustrate the fact that the theoretically possible technical scope for more efficient use of one particular resource, namely energy, with essentially no change in the real level of material amenity. That is to say, no real change in lifestyle. As another example, most of the commonly used metals form an important fraction of the Earth's crust. Iron and aluminum are particular examples. Iron ores we now exploit have a concentration only 6 times that of the average in the Earth's crust. Bauxite, the ore of aluminum, is only about 4 times richer than common clays. Magnesium, a possible substitute for aluminum, is infinitely abundant, in effect, in seawater. There's enough uranium in the world's oceans alone to run breeder reactors at current world energy consumption levels for 600,000 years. Indeed, there is enough uranium above ground already from the tails of the enrichment process used to make weapons to be equivalent to our entire coal reserve. All of this requires an indefinitely sustainable source of energy and possibly a level of investment much higher than we now devote to materials extraction. If it becomes necessary and the price is right, the technology can be developed to recycle most of the metals we commonly use. And incidentally, recycling is usually from 5 to 10 times less energy intensive than virgin extraction. In addition, what can be said about efficiency in energy use can also undoubtedly be said about efficiency in the use of other materials. Most of the valuable alloying metals used in much smaller quantities than iron are recoverable from seabed deposits, which constitute a vastly greater resource base than the most accessible and richer land deposits we exploit now. This, too, requires anticipation, investment, and energy. In a sense, no resource, even the absorptive capacity of the environment, which is also in a sense a resource, is truly used up. It can always be recovered or restored at some price, though this price could and might exceed what some part of the world's inhabitants could afford to pay. In this sense, resources are not finite and the pie is expandable, although given sufficient time, technical wisdom, and the willingness to defer current consumption to ensure future supply. In this matter of investment, let me remind you that nearly 10% of the world's GNP and more than 25% of its technical talent is currently being invested in military preparations. This is a prime drain on resources which could be being invested in future productivity. It is a prime example of where the pressure for short-term unilateral advantage of subgroups of humanity wins out over a clear long-term collective benefit to all. This military expenditure, plus the claims on current output generated by population growth in the underdeveloped countries, and perhaps some extent by escalating material expectations in the developed countries, are the real bottlenecks which becloud our future. Clearly, the world will eventually reach a point where the investment necessary just to keep material consumption constant with a clean environment will consume any further growth in GNP. This will occur earlier and at a lower per capita consumption level, the larger the rate of population growth and the more we fail to defer current consumption for future benefit. But in the view I have outlined, the world is not a zero-sum game in which one person's gain is another's loss. On the contrary, the mutual gain achievable through cooperative effort outweighs the unilateral advantage that can be gained by any subgroup acting purely in its own particularistic interest. Thus, the more we avail ourselves of the potential of science and technology, the more we should find ourselves in a positive-sum game. That is to say, a game in which all players gain by making mutual concessions. The real catch is that the gains from mutuality tend to be much longer term than the gains possible through striving for a unilateral advantage. Both investment in future productivity and cooperative effort share the characteristic of demanding the sacrifice of some current satisfaction for future benefit, that once much maligned middle-class virtue of deferred gratification. In a world of widely differing consumption levels, there is an inevitable battle over whose gratification is to be deferred. One of the issues involved, for example, is the extent to which investment resources should come from the relatively affluent in the less developed countries as compared with the poorer parts of the population in the industrialized countries. The new economic order put forward by the less developed countries calls for raising the price of raw materials imported by the developed countries and opening up developed country markets to imports of finished goods and processed raw materials from the LDCs. Both of these measures are ones which would adversely affect the less affluent in the developed countries and may benefit primarily capitalists and entrepreneurs in the less developed countries. So this is a problem. It is interesting to note that with a few exceptions, only the communist societies, China and Russia, have been able to resist consumption demands sufficiently to put a large share of their resources into investment. But this investment has so far largely gone into producing more investment goods or military hardware, with only slow growth in consumer goods and agriculture. For example, the growth of producer goods output in China, particularly machine tools, has increased at an average rate of 20% a year, compared with 6% a year for consumer goods and only 2% a year for agricultural products. The centrally planned economies have been also rather inefficient in both their allocation and utilization of investment resources. On the other hand, the capitalist welfare states use their investments much more efficiently, but find it difficult to defer consumption sufficiently to provide for their future. And this is equally true in most of the non-communist developing world, though more for the reason of rapid population growth than of rising expectations. The investment necessary to provide for the future must also be such as to embody a high degree of technological progress, and probably one somewhat more focused on critical future bottlenecks such as energy, environment, and materials than has been true in the recent past. Furthermore, the realization of this relatively optimistic model for the future depends on several other conditions which will not necessarily be realized. This is why I say that salvation is just possible, not inevitable. These other conditions are, first, the realization of an indefinitely sustainable energy supply. This could be based either on renewable resources derived from solar energy, on the breeder reactor in some variant, or possibly on fusion, or most likely on some mix of all of these. Secondly, the continuation of a world trading system that makes possible the efficient use of the entire world resource base for the benefit of all. Third, the leveling off of population growth within about 50 years. And fourth, the continuation of a system for generating technological progress and embodying it in capital investment in durable goods, which generates more product and final consumer services for a given resource input. So the overriding problem of the next half century or so is the effectuation of a transition to an indefinitely sustainable energy economy plus a steady state population. At present, only one long-term energy source is well developed, the fission breeder, and its social acceptability is in doubt. The other is social energy, probably in a mix of several technologies. Did I say social energy? I meant to say solar energy. It looks feasible and environmentally benign, but is not well enough developed to be truly assessed. Its investment costs would certainly be very high. Because of the problem of the effect of carbon dioxide on climate, the world will almost certainly have to wean itself away from fossil fuels before our abundant coal supplies are exhausted, unless we can find a way of disposing of the carbon dioxide in the deep oceans. Thus, the transition to permanent energy sources may have to occur sooner than would be dictated by fossil fuel reserves alone. Fusion is another option, but is too speculative to be counted on at the present time. In addition, neither the breeder nor solar energy and their present technological embodiments can really cope with the problem of transportable fuels needed for transportation and for decentralized use in industry. However, this is surely a solvable technical problem given sufficient time. Only the question of cost is in doubt. My principal concern is that at the present time, too much of our research and development effort is going into electric power generation, which is only 10% of final energy demand, and too little into ways of making transportable fuels from renewable resources or from nuclear energy. I would also emphasize that it is not necessary to design the future now in every detail. We need to recognize not only the factor of unpleasant surprises discovered after the deployment of new technology, but also the unpredictable factor of human creativity, which tends to be neglected nowadays, which will help in offsetting these inevitable problems. There is a clear trade-off between the ultimate world population and the average per capita income, which is indefinitely sustainable in the sense of equilibrium between investment and consumption that I mentioned earlier. That this can happen does not mean that it will happen. What I am really saying is that a sustainable and equitable human future is possible without leveling downward, provided population does not get out of hand. It is a possibility which is not constrained by technical and resource considerations, but it should be quite clear that rapid advance of science and technology is a necessary precondition, though by no means a sufficient one. The big question being raised by the critics of a technological future is whether the kind of social world created is compatible with safe and effective democratic management of a highly technological society. More and more the critics are, for example, of nuclear power are shifting from criticisms of the technical characteristics to the capacity of the human institutions to manage this technology safely and responsibly, as I mentioned earlier. They are attacking the credibility of regulatory institutions and arguing that adequate engineering plans and safeguards will inevitably founder on faulty and corrupt implementation. These critics also point to the rising tide of crime and terrorism that seems to characterize all industrial societies in the world of today. And they suggest that this is a byproduct of the alienation induced by the complexity and impersonality of the institutions, which they say necessarily characterize a technological society. They go on to say that the existence of such alienated individuals and groups is incompatible with the vulnerabilities that characterize the complexity and interdependence of modern society. In other words, do technological societies produce social conditions which breed the seeds of their own disintegration? At the same time, the measures needed to suppress crime and terrorism seem incompatible with the democratic values and civil liberties which make material affluence worthwhile. I think these questions are unanswerable at the present time. A very similar point is made from another perspective by those who accept the desirability of technology but are frustrated by our inability to get on with it. We have greatly increased the expectations of the individual, not only for material well-being, but also with respect to his influence on and participation in social decisions which potentially affect his welfare. Thus, society has to accommodate to an increasing variety of individual and group interests, while also having to exhibit greater logical coherence and consistency in its decisions because of their increasingly wide systemic effects. Fragmented and personalized interests and values are difficult to blend with rational planning. A large power grid requires a degree of rational, centralized planning, which is hard to reconcile with satisfying all the variety of conflicting interests which are affected. As a result, we find that the requirements for democratic participation are in collision with the requirements of internal consistency in the social management of technology. More and more people expect to eat their cake and have it too, and few of the actors have much incentive to consider the larger context of a decision in their desire to ensure that their particular interests or values are fully protected in the outcome. As a result, we seem to be experiencing currently a paralysis of decision-making and an escalation of the transaction costs, as they're called, of even the simplest public decisions. This is nowhere more apparent than in the case of energy. Whether this is a temporary phenomenon representing the early stages of a new social learning process, which I tend to suspect it is, or whether it is a permanent and growing disability of industrial democracies, it is probably too early to say. But it could represent the greatest single obstacle to realization of the potential of science and technology to provide viable solutions to the grave problems we face. In a nutshell, the urgency of the problems that face us may require a wide social consensus in order to proceed in a sustained way towards their solution. There probably are, in fact, several nearly equally viable routes to a solution, but I doubt if they will work or can be pursued simultaneously. They contain mutually incompatible elements. Yet our own material prosperity and the magnetic attraction it exerts on the rest of the world seems to make achievement of the necessary consensus more and more difficult. This is so precisely because we are not in the sort of crisis we're used to in wartime or as a result of external challenge. Thus, the more I study these problems, the more apparent it becomes that the barriers to their solution are institutional and political rather than technical. When a crisis of some sort creates a temporary consensus dominated by one readily identified social goal, we seem to be able to work wonders with science and technology. The last dramatic example was the decade of national commitment to a moon landing following the Russian Sputnik. But the serious problems like energy, food, and world poverty are not crises, and they impinge on too many varied interests and competitive values to be susceptible of the single-minded treatment accorded for a time to space exploration. Thus, the problems that confront us fail to attract sustained political attention, despite transient alarm signals and much passionate rhetoric by a few people. They do not seem to be able to command a lasting public consensus on a logically consistent set of policies and priorities. The nature of the problems is beyond the imagination and visualization of most people. There's no simple slogan about which we can rally for long. Project Independence hardly outlasted a year. The world food crisis hardly outlasted the 1973 grain shortfall and the Russian wheat deal. The environmental crisis gave ground before the energy crisis. The Northeast water crisis of the 1960s, which everybody has now forgotten, dissolved in a decade of abundant rainfall. The population explosion is a creeping catastrophe which is remote and slow-acting, and over which the average American feels he can have little leverage. Despite all this frustration, I remain an optimist, possibly only because of my training as a scientist in the generation in which I grew up. I believe that science and technology can place solutions to our problems within our grasp, and I find it difficult to believe that the frailty of human institutions in the last analysis will ultimately deny us the realization of the opportunities which lie within our technical capabilities. So I end with the proposition that science is still more destiny than doom, but I also have to admit that it is much more nip and tuck than I would have said 10 years ago. Thank you.
That was Harvey Brooks, the Benjamin Pierce Professor of Technology and Public Policy at Harvard University, speaking on science and technology, hope or catastrophe. The lecture was taped at Iowa State University on Monday, April 4th. Earlier on today's program, you heard Carol Purcell, visiting professor at the Center for 20th Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, speaking on the American ideal of a democratic technology, from Jefferson to ecology, a lecture taped on October 10th. Rostrum is a public affairs presentation. Today's program came to you from Ames on Iowa Public Radio.